claimed to have found someone who made her truly happy, someone who, in her view, was her soulmate. She said I no longer measured up. Despite her growing intensity, her words felt increasingly distant. Our story wasn't unique. We met in high school, married, and soon welcomed our daughter, Sally. While she wasn't the reason we got married, she had always been part of our plan. We had stable jobs, a paid-off house, and a comfortable life. We expressed love openly, took family trips, and although the physical side of our relationship had diminished, we still shared moments of closeness. I believed we were meant to grow old together, but this afternoon shattered that belief. As Annie's tirade continued, her face grew redder. "Arthur, look at me!" she demanded. It was getting harder to focus, but I turned to her. "You need to sign these papers," she insisted, pointing firmly at the documents. Her commanding tone clashed with my inability to concentrate. The room's light seemed to dim, though the kitchen lights were on. Inside, I was overwhelmed, but outwardly, I felt paralyzed. Annie's frustration escalated as I stayed silent. The last thing I remember was her slap. Though I didn't feel it, I imagined a vivid red mark left behind. Even so, I couldn't move, and the world seemed to dim further. It had been a long day. My drive home from university was delayed due to an accident that slowed traffic. When I got home, the house felt unsettlingly quiet. Dad's car was in the driveway, but Mom's was missing. Entering the kitchen, I dropped my bag and books on the floor. Dad was at the table, motionless, staring blankly. An open wine bottle sat nearby, with a mostly empty glass. Before him were papers marked with "Sign Here" tabs. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, Dad?" I expected a response, but he didn't react. Moving to face him, I was startled by his glazed, tear-streaked eyes. He wasn't blinking, and drool hung from his lips, ready to fall. Panicking, I called out, "Dad! Dad, come back!" Tears blurred my vision as I struggled to calm myself. "Slow down, Sally. Dad needs help," I whispered, pulling out my phone to call emergency services. I explained to my father Arthur was unresponsive and provided our details. They promised an ambulance would arrive in 10 minutes. Sitting beside Dad, I held his hand, offering comfort. This man had been my rock growing up. Despite his demanding job, he never missed my school plays, ballet recitals, or music lessons. On my 16th birthday, he gave me a violin. Not the fanciest, but one filled with sentimental value. Now, 5 years later, I was studying music in college, specializing in strings thanks to his unwavering support. As I waited, questions raced through my mind. What had caused this? Where was Mom? Looking at the papers on the table, I noticed the words "petition for divorce." My stomach dropped as I read further, realizing Mom was divorcing Dad. The wine bottle hinted she had delivered the papers before leaving. Her abandonment seemed to have broken him. The betrayal left me numb. Any love or compassion I had for my mother dissipated. When the ambulance arrived, I helped guide the paramedics, ensuring Dad was carefully moved onto a stretcher. After locking up the house, I followed them to the hospital, making calls along the way. I informed Grandma, Dad's mom, his sister Rhonda, his best friend, and his boss about the situation, explaining Dad was unresponsive and en route to the hospital. Everyone asked for updates, and his boss assured me they'd handle his emergency leave. With a knot of anger in my chest, I knew I had to call Mom. The phone rang twice before she answered, her tone casual. "Hi, Sally, my love. How's your day?" I was stunned by her nonchalance. Surely she couldn't be oblivious to what had happened. "Where are you, Mom?" I asked. "Oh, I'm just out and about," she said, her voice trailing off. "So you've left Dad, your husband, shattered, and you think that's fine?" "Oh, no, sweetheart," she replied, trying to justify herself. "I told your father about Paul and the situation, but he wasn't responsive, so I thought it best to leave and let him process that we won't be living with him anymore." Her dismissive attitude enraged me. Given Dad's state, it felt like she'd ripped out his heart and left him broken. You abandoned him when he needed you the most. Do you even care about what you've done? My voice trembled with anger. "Sweetheart, don't get upset now," she began. "I understand this is a lot to process, but your father will recover. I'm simply asking for what I'm entitled to and a bit of support while Paul and I wait to get married. My mother, it seemed, was completely detached from reality. You think I'm angry now? You haven't seen real anger yet, Mother. For your information, I'm currently following Dad to the hospital. He's in an ambulance, and when I got home, he looked like he'd suffered a stroke. Oh, Sally, my sweet girl, I'm so sorry to hear that. No excuses, Mother. Let me ask you something. Is this Paul you've run off with the same Paul from work you're always talking about? She hesitated. Of course, sweetheart. Paul. The Paul from her workplace. She never stopped bringing him up. So, let me get this straight. He's a dozen years younger than you. And how long have you been seeing him? Another pause. 6 months. Right. So, for half a year, you've been sneaking around with this man from work, lying to both Dad and me, and keeping your affair a secret. Neither of us had any idea you were capable of this level of betrayal. Clearly, Dad didn't either, based on the state you left him in. How exactly did you think we'd react? Well, I didn't expect positivity at first, but once we're living with Paul, you'll see that we're meant to be together. She said we again. Did she honestly believe I'd abandon Dad to move in with her and her boyfriend? My anger reached a boiling point. I knew if I didn't stop, I'd say something unforgivable. I'm ending this conversation before I say something I'll regret. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. I'm staying with Dad. There's no chance I'll go anywhere near Paul or the place you're shacking up with him. Sally, my mother snapped, I'm your mother, and you will not speak to me like that no matter how upset you are. Then I guess we're done here. I ended the call before she could respond. If she thought I'd support her actions, she was sorely mistaken. She called me repeatedly afterward, then started trying Dad's phone. That was pointless. If he could answer, I doubted he'd take her call. Since I had Dad's phone with me, I ignored all her attempts. By the time I reached the hospital, the paramedics had admitted Dad, and he was in a ward under observation. Aunt Rhonda had arrived, saying she'd gotten several calls from Mom but didn't know what was going on, beyond her brother being hospitalized. When I explained the situation, Aunt Rhonda's face turned a deep, furious red, almost as if steam was about to pour from her ears. Sally, do you have the papers that woman left for your father? Here, Aunt Rhonda. I handed them over. Besides being my aunt, Rhonda was also our family's lawyer. For the next hour, we sat beside Dad as she reviewed the documents, occasionally muttering under her breath. Nurses and doctors came and went, checking on Dad regularly. The bad news, Rhonda began, is that your mother will get her divorce. The timeline here shows this process has been in motion for over 2 months and had to be served this week to avoid steep additional fees from her lawyers. I shrugged. I'd already heard enough of Mom's excuses. My focus now was ensuring she and Dad went their separate ways after everything she'd done. The good news, Rhonda continued with a small grin, is that she hired an inexperienced lawyer. She'll be paying a significant amount for this divorce, and even more if it goes to court. Meanwhile, your father has the best attorney in town, and he's getting the family discount. We shared a brief smile, a rare moment of levity that evening. Also, some of her demands, like claiming 50% of the house equity and 60% of the financial assets, plus spousal and child support, are absurdly inflated. From your reaction, I assume you're not planning to live with your mother? I nodded. Good. That's settled. I have some initial ideas, but we need to see how your father's condition evolves over the next 24 hours. Depending on what happens, your mother could face accusations of abandonment and emotional cruelty. The next few days passed in a blur. Doctors checked on Dad frequently. Physically, he was fine, but he remained unresponsive. I kept up with my university work from his bedside, using my laptop and textbooks in the hospital chair. Occasionally, a family member would take over, allowing me to go home for a few hours of sleep before returning. I won't lie, I shed some tears during those lonely moments at home. One of the most surprising events during Dad's hospital stay was when Tina Williams, the owner of the company Dad worked for, came to visit. While I was familiar with his manager, Tom, I'd never met Tina before. Tina was a stunning woman, curvy but not overweight, with sun-kissed skin, jet black hair, and striking blue eyes that seemed capable of enchanting anyone, regardless of gender. As it turned out, a few years ago, Dad had been part of a team at work that supported Tina during her turbulent divorce. Her unfaithful ex-husband had nearly succeeded in taking a significant portion of their savings and half of her company. It was Dad who connected her with Aunt Rhonda, who expertly safeguarded Tina's assets, ensuring she retained full ownership of her business and secured child support for her 6-year-old daughter. Tina visited Dad multiple times during his hospital stay, clearly shaken when I gave her a brief summary of the events leading to his admission. She brought cards signed by his colleagues and spent hours by his bedside, holding his hand and sharing office stories. It became apparent that Dad's sense of humor had made him a cherished figure at work, and his absence was keenly felt. I should add that Dad worked as an accountant for a financial clearinghouse, assisting banks in processing payments to other financial institutions. While the job itself might be dull, Dad had evidently brightened everyone's day with his jokes and warm personality. About 2 weeks later, I came back to the hospital after a quick shower and nap at home. Upon entering Dad's room, I found Aunt Rhonda and Tina deep in conversation, though their frustration wasn't directed at each other but at my mother. Apparently, Mom had sent a formal letter to Tina, demanding access to all of Dad's bonuses from the past few years. Despite the bonuses already being paid out, Mom's letter insisted she receive 50% of them within 30 days or face legal action. This just shows how desperate she and her new partner are, Rhonda remarked with a sardonic smile. I've frozen all the joint assets while Arthur's incapacitated, I chuckled, announcing my presence. That makes sense. She actually sent me a text this morning, her first communication in 2 weeks, asking if I could loan her a few $1,000s. I haven't replied. I'm still furious with her. And she hasn't once asked about Dad since all this happened. Over the past weeks, Tina had grown fiercely protective of Dad. Anytime my mother came up in conversation, Tina's demeanor shifted. Her eyes darkened and her voice dropped, brimming with disdain for Annie. It was as though sparks of anger flickered around her. I hoped Tina never had to share a room with Mom. I feared she might unleash her fury on the spot. Despite my feelings toward my mother, she was still my mom. Tina's voice softened. Your father is an incredible man, Sally. Without him, I wouldn't have Clarice or my business. He supported me when my world was falling apart. He listened without judgment, never offering opinions on my ex-husband or me. He simply let me vent. Nobody else has ever done that for me. If he'd been single after my divorce, I'd have pursued him with everything I had. I let a small smile cross my face. Well, he won't be married much longer. Their faces lit up with realization. Rhonda chuckled and Tina smiled. Thanks, Sally. I needed that. Tina's expression darkened again. I still can't believe your mother would treat him this way, let alone throw away such a wonderful man. She checked her watch. I need to get back to the office. But before leaving, Tina walked to Dad's bedside. Rhonda and I watched as she leaned down and kissed him gently on the lips, a gesture filled with warmth and sincerity. She turned to us with a smile, which quickly shifted to surprise when Dad let out a faint groan. As I regained consciousness, I became aware of the softness of lips on mine, a tender, affectionate sensation I hadn't experienced in years. The beeping of the hospital monitors brought me back to reality. Expecting Annie, I opened my eyes and was startled to find Tina standing there, her smile brightening my room. Sally and Rhonda joined her at my bedside. It's okay, Daddy, Sally said reassuringly. You're going to be fine. Memories came flooding back. Annie had either left me or was in the process of doing so. What happened? I asked weakly. The three of them filled me in. Sally, finding me unresponsive, the ambulance ride, and the discovery of Annie's infidelity and divorce papers. I learned about how Annie had threatened Tina and how Rhonda froze our finances until my condition could be assessed. How long? I asked. 2 weeks, Rhonda replied. Turning to Tina, I managed a small smile. You kissed me. Tina blushed. Yes, I was saying goodbye before heading back to work. Sorry about that. I chuckled softly. No need to apologize. I suppose I'm on the market now, so it's okay. For the next few hours, doctors came in to conduct physical exams and tests. Tina canceled her plans for the day and stayed with us. Among the medical staff was a psychologist who asked me to recount recent events. I described finding Annie drinking alone, her announcement of leaving me, and how the world seemed to lose all color and coherence. My last memory was of Annie slapping and yelling at me, her words an unintelligible blur. Sally gasped, her face pale. "Dad, what time do you think this happened?" "Maybe around 5 o'clock or 5:30, I replied. Sally nodded. "I got home after 7:30 and found you there. There wasn't even a mark on your face, so she must have left you alone for a while," the psychologist interjected. "It's not uncommon for individuals in your position to experience neglect or harm while unresponsive. It seems like you experienced shock after hearing your wife's declaration about leaving you," the psychologist began. "While this is an extreme reaction, it's not entirely surprising." Rhonda chimed in. "When Arthur was younger, there was a bully a few years older who used to pick on him. One day, a neighbor found Arthur lying in the park. Our parents put him to bed and he woke up the next morning. Nobody gave it much thought since he seemed fine afterward." "I remember that," I said, recalling the incident. "Billy was pushing me around and taunting me at the park. I don't remember much else, but when I woke up, Mom and Dad told me someone had brought me home. They spoke to Billy's parents, and the next day, he apologized to me at school. I doubt he meant it," I added with a chuckle, "but he never bothered me again." The psychologist nodded. "This might set a precedent," he said thoughtfully. "The mind is still a mystery in many ways. But if something similar happened before, it's reasonable to think it could occur again." I frowned slightly, but he reassured me. "Don't worry too much. With these 3 wonderful women by your side, even if something similar happens, I believe you'll be well cared for." We chatted for a bit longer before he excused himself. I found myself feeling unexpectedly tired, which might seem strange after 2 weeks of sleep. Nevertheless, I encouraged the 3 women to go home and rest, assuring them they could visit tomorrow. Over the next 2 days, I slowly eased back into a routine. Tina brought me a work laptop and a few light tasks to tackle, emphasizing that I should only do them if I got bored. Rhonda stopped by to discuss the updated divorce papers and had me sign some documents to finalize proceedings with Annie. She also introduced me to a young detective named Karen Hill. Detective Hill spent about an hour interviewing me regarding the events with Annie. Afterward, she thanked me and informed Rhonda and me that her report would be ready in a few days. I wasn't entirely sure if we planned to press charges against Annie, but Rhonda told me to leave everything in her hands. She kissed me on the forehead and left. By the second afternoon, after waking up from what Sally jokingly referred to as my checkout, I was discharged and allowed to return home. Sally accompanied me, and to my surprise, Tina was waiting at the door. She helped Sally guide me into her large black SUV. That evening, Tina stayed for dinner. We ordered takeout, and she helped clean up before joining us for a couple of hours of TV. When she left, Sally hugged her and insisted I walk her to her car. "Tina, thank you for everything you've done these past weeks," I said gratefully. "I don't know how I can repay you." "Well," she replied with a playful smile, "in a few weeks, when you're feeling better, you can take me out for dinner and dancing." I blushed. Here I was, just hours out of the hospital, and the woman whose kiss had brought me back to life was asking me out. But she was undeniably attractive, and with Annie gone, I was technically single again. "How about next Friday night after work? That gives me almost 2 weeks to get back to normal." She nodded, giving me a warm hug that lingered longer than expected, hinting at something deeper. As she drove away, I found it amusing that, for a fleeting moment, I couldn't even remember the name of the woman I'd been married to for nearly 25 years. In the days that followed, Sally, Rhonda, and Tina checked on me constantly, ensuring I was okay. Their care was comforting, but the news Rhonda brought on Friday caught us all off guard. "This afternoon, Annie was arrested," Rhonda announced. "What happened?" I asked, surprised. "Well," she explained, "after your statement to the police, they issued an arrest warrant for mental cruelty. Since you were incapacitated and unable to defend yourself, leaving you unattended added to her charges." "What does that mean for the divorce?" Tina asked. She had joined us for dinner and brought along her 8-year-old daughter, Clarice, who was watching a Disney movie in the living room. Rhonda grinned. This will likely tip things in Arthur's favor. I'm pushing for a fair 50-50 split of the bank accounts in the house. We could argue for more, but I think Arthur would prefer fairness. I nodded. Annie won't touch the bonus money she tried to claim, Tina added. I filed a separate case for extortion to go along with the mental cruelty charge. While it may not do much beyond barring her from access to money that isn't hers, it sets the record straight. She'll probably be out in a few days, none the worse for wear, back with her equally awful partner. My focus is on speeding up the divorce, using your hospitalization and recovery as leverage. Depending on her response, I have plans to ensure you don't lose anything unjustly. How long will it take? Sally asked. Rhonda replied, if everything goes smoothly, about 3 months. But if Annie decides to fight, I'll bring in additional support, Rhonda explained that evening as I walked Tina to her car. Nearby, Sally was helping Clarice into the backseat of the large Suburban. Tina embraced me again and caught me off guard with a brief kiss reminiscent of the one from the other day. Arthur, she began, I know you're still married and a man of honor, so I won't rush anything. But I need to stake my claim now and tell you that I want you. I've desired you for a long time, but I would never go after a married man or disrespect someone's vows. I've been through that myself, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, even if their marriage is failing, Tina admitted earnestly. For a moment, I stared into her striking blue eyes, brushed a lock of her dark hair from her face, and leaned in for a kiss. What began as a gentle gesture quickly turned into something more intense, lasting close to 30 seconds. The connection between us was undeniable. When I finally pulled back, Tina's eyes were closed as she ran her tongue across her lips, savoring the moment. I smiled and said, consider that my acknowledgement of your claim. We glanced at the girls who were giggling at the display. Clarice clapped her hands enthusiastically, while Sally beamed a wide grin. As Tina and Clarice drove off, Sally hugged me, and we both waved goodbye. The months that followed were a whirlwind. On one hand, Annie seemed eager to finalize the divorce quickly. On the other, she wasn't satisfied with the settlement terms. It became apparent that Paul was influencing her decisions, convincing her she deserved the majority of the assets. Deep down, she likely knew his promises were empty, but after so many years of marriage, it was hard to let go. When Annie's demands became increasingly unreasonable, Rhonda had a single conversation with her lawyer. Whatever was said during that exchange, it ended all disputes overnight. Meanwhile, Tina and I began going on dates every Friday night. Sally took on the role of babysitter for Clarice, picking her up from school and looking after her so Tina and I could enjoy dinner, coffee, and other outings. Though we limited ourselves to holding hands and sharing kisses, I had a strong feeling that the night my divorce was finalized would be unforgettable. Back at work, everything was running smoothly. Although our financial firm wasn't a major player, we all performed our roles well, received fair pay, and enjoyed working together. At some point, I suspect the team realized Tina and I were seeing each other. Thankfully, everyone seemed supportive. I did, however, tone down my usual antics after my manager, who reported directly to Tina, reminded me about maintaining professional behavior, considering I was dating his boss. About 3.5 months later, we received a notice that the divorce would be finalized in 1 week on the following Thursday. There were no court proceedings required, but Annie requested a meeting to discuss matters before the final ruling. I agreed, and we scheduled the meeting at my house for the day before. To prepare, I took the afternoon off work and cooked lamb chops with gnocchi in a browned butter sauce, one of our shared favorite meals. I hoped the comforting dinner would help reduce any tension. That evening, Sally arrived home around 5:30, took a shower, and changed. Just before 6, the doorbell rang, signaling Annie's arrival. It's been a while since I've described Annie's appearance, but now feels like the right time, as it's starkly different from before. A few months ago, she was an attractive woman in her mid-40s. Her shoulder-length brown hair, curvy figure typical of a mother, and a few extra pounds complemented her well. She had a proportionate 34C bust and an appealing silhouette. However, the person standing at my door was almost unrecognizable. Annie had gained a considerable amount of weight, with jowls under her chin, puffier cheeks, and a stomach that now sagged over her pants. Her previously shapely figure had changed, and she wore loose clothing that seemed to obscure even more. I have no bias against people of different sizes. But this wasn't the Annie I remembered. My reaction must have been obvious, as Annie grimaced, but chose not to comment on it. Hi Annie, please come in, I greeted her. Once in the kitchen, I poured her a glass of wine, which she accepted, and we exchanged small talk. She asked about my job and how I'd been doing, but I avoided asking about her health. Addressing the unspoken, Annie said, "It's what Paul wants. He didn't like how thin I was, so we've been working on adding weight." I frowned. For over 25 years, I'd loved this woman despite her faults. And a small part of me still cared about her well-being, though much less than before. "You don't approve, do you?" she asked, reading my expression. "No, Annie, I don't," I admitted. "When we were together, you were healthy. To be honest, I'm shocked by how you look now. You don't seem well. If I weren't so hurt by what you've done, I'd be more worried about your health and would try to help." I expressed, "But you don't care, do you?" Her expression dropped. "You and Sally, you're happy and doing fine without me, aren't you?" "Well, a part of me does care," I admitted. "But when you walked out of here and basically abandoned me, I trailed off, shrugging. She exhaled deeply. "I deserve that. What I did was awful, wasn't it?" "No, Mom," Sally interjected, fresh from the shower. "It wasn't awful. It was absolutely horrible. You tore apart a happy family all on your own and left without a second thought. Honestly, I don't know why Dad even agreed to let you come here tonight." "Sally, that's enough," I said, stepping in. "Your mother knows how bad things are and how unhappy we all are. She asked for this meeting, so I figured the least we could do is hear her out and behave like adults." Sally was clearly displeased. She, like me, hadn't spoken to her mother since that day everything changed. The way Sally was glaring at her made it clear this wasn't going to end well for anyone. It was time to redirect the conversation. Trying to lighten the mood, I said, "Heavy discussions aren't the best way to start dinner. Let's eat first." I served the meal, and while no one said a word, there were plenty of glances exchanged across the table. Throughout dinner, Sally maintained her piercing stare at her mother. Afterward, as I cleared the table, Annie asked to speak with Sally alone. "Absolutely not. Whatever you have to say, you can say it with both of us here," Sally replied firmly. I felt conflicted, but it was obvious Sally wasn't willing to be alone with her mother. Annie seemed to understand that, her eyes showing a flicker of guilt. Resigned, she took a deep breath, hesitating before she spoke. "Sally, I want to apologize to you for what happened that night. I didn't handle things the right way. Despite everything, I don't want to lose my daughter forever," Annie said, glancing at me before adding, "There's more I'd like to say, but I'd prefer to discuss it private, without your father here." "Sorry, Mom," Sally responded. "If you can't say it with him here, I'm not interested in hearing it." Before Annie could say anything, Sally got up and stormed out of the room, slamming her bedroom door behind her. "I hoped that would go better," Annie muttered under her breath, more to herself than to me. "Honestly, given the circumstances, I think it went as well as it could," I replied, trying to reassure her. "Really?" Annie asked, sounding surprised. "Yes, really," I said with a sigh. "Annie, you need to understand that no one in this house feels much affection for you right now." She began to respond, but I raised my hand, signaling her to let me finish. "First, you carried on a long-term affair and hid it from both Sally and me. Then, out of nowhere, you served me with divorce papers. When I fell into what Sally calls checkout mode, you screamed, shouted, and even slapped me." Annie looked stunned, like a deer caught in headlights. "I remember that," she said quietly. "Let me continue," I said firmly. "At some point, after you slapped me, you abandoned me while I was unresponsive, leaving me there until Sally came home and found me in that state. When Sally called you, clearly upset about her father, you showed no concern. You didn't even ask about my well-being until tonight. Instead, you made unreasonable demands of my job. And now, you come here asking Sally for forgiveness. Yet you haven't actually apologized to her at all. I paused, hoping my words would sink in. So, yes, Annie. Given everything, I think things went as well as they could. Annie dropped her gaze to the floor, tears welling in her eyes. They didn't fall, but they hovered there, threatening to. I couldn't tell if her tears were for Sally, for me, or simply for herself. I continued, tomorrow, our divorce will be finalized. Unless you have anything else to say, I think we've fulfilled your request for this final meeting. I walked to the door and opened it. Annie glanced at me before stepping outside. Once there, she turned to face me. Arthur, we did have some good years, didn't we? She asked. Yes, Annie, I replied. Most of our time together was wonderful. You were an amazing partner, a devoted wife, and a caring mother. But the woman standing before me now isn't the same person I fell in love with. What I see now is someone who's lost, manipulated into becoming someone else. Someone focused on what others can give you rather than the people themselves. Her eyes fell to the ground again. The unshed tears still lingered. You really mean that, don't you, Arthur? She asked softly. Yes, I do, I affirmed. She turned to leave but hesitated, looking utterly broken. Arthur, about the house, Paul told me I should ask you. So that was her reason for coming. It wasn't about reconciling with her family, it was about money. I chuckled, leaving Annie looking confused. Go tell your soulmate, I said, that the savings and your share of the house's equity will be transferred to the account your lawyer provided by tomorrow. And Annie, protect that money from Paul, or you won't have it for long. The next morning marked the finalization of our divorce. Annie and I were no longer husband and wife. A faint sadness lingered within me, but it quickly passed. Over the past few months, I'd finally found peace. Life had been tough for everyone, but now, at 48 years old, I felt a sense of freedom, knowing there was still so much life ahead. Rhonda called earlier, saying she'd take care of dinner tonight, a pizza night at my place. During lunch at work, Sally stopped by. We reminisced about the happier times when her mother was still part of our family. Despite Sally's clear disdain for her mom, I could tell she missed the woman her mother used to be. To be honest, I missed that version of her too. We had shared some truly good years together. As Sally left, there was a brief, wordless exchange between her and Tina. Not long after, I was called into Tina's office. She shut the door, then kissed me with an intensity as if time was running out. I'll admit, I kissed her back with just as much enthusiasm. Can I finally call you mine, Arthur? Tina asked, leaving a faint, tender mark on my neck where her lips had been. I think you already have, I replied with a grin. That evening's dinner was a joyous occasion. Sally, Rhonda, Tina, and Clarice all gathered to celebrate my new chapter, free from Annie's shadow. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Tina and I took our relationship to the next level. Judging by how sore she seemed to be throughout the weekend, I must have done something right. Her eyes sparkled with a fire reserved for me alone. 6 months later, Tina and I exchanged vows in a lovely lakeside ceremony. Many of our co-workers came to celebrate with us. Though we had originally planned to marry much later, we moved the date forward to coincide with the arrival of Sally and Clarice's baby brother. 5 years went by in the blink of an eye. One evening, Sally, her boyfriend Tina, and I were enjoying dinner at a cozy restaurant when Keegan, now 5 years old, asked, "Daddy, who's that lady staring at us?" I turned to see who he meant and noticed Annie sitting across the room. She looked thinner and far less happy than she had been when we were together. Since the divorce, she had neither reached out to us nor contacted Sally. Excusing myself, I walked over to her. "Hi, Annie," I said. "Hi, Arthur. How are you?" she asked, her gaze dropping to her untouched chicken salad. "I'm fine," I replied. "And you?" "You were right," she said quietly. "Paul made me believe I was his soulmate, that you meant nothing to him. But after I received the money from the settlement, he convinced me to gain weight because he claimed to love bigger women. I didn't listen to your warning and gave him the money. He spent it all in 6 months and left me with nothing. Though I still harbored anger toward her, her story lacked the happy ending mine had found. I've been trying ever since to rebuild what he destroyed in me, to rediscover who I was before him. she admitted, her voice trembling. Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued. Arthur, I am so sorry. I treated you horribly because I believed Paul's lies. I abandoned the man who truly loved me and left you in a state where you could have died. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to apologize. Tears began streaming down her face as she looked at me. Before I could respond, Sally appeared beside me, having overheard her mother's words. She offered me a small, cautious smile before extending her hand toward Annie. Seeing her daughter's gesture, Annie panicked and tried to leave, but Sally stepped in front of her. Mom, stop. You don't need to go, Sally said, sliding into the booth beside her. I joined them, sitting across from the two. I glanced at Tina, who gave me a supportive nod. For the next hour, mother and daughter talked, shedding many tears. But this time, they were tears of healing rather than pain. When their conversation ended, Sally and I introduced Annie to the rest of the group. Annie appeared uneasy when we introduced her to Keegan as Auntie Annie. From that day on, we began slowly welcoming Annie back into our lives. She and Sally reconnected through occasional coffee meetups, rebuilding trust one step at a time. When Sally got married, Annie had the chance to act as mother of the bride. Even Tina occasionally invited Annie over for dinner. At first, I suspected she did it to emphasize what Annie had lost, and Tina had gained by marrying me. Yet, over time, the two women developed an unusual rapport. Though they never became close friends, they shared a kind of understanding that I couldn't quite grasp. Rhonda, however, never forgave Annie for what she had done to me. She remained polite, but distant whenever they crossed paths. With Tina's blessing, Annie and I attended counseling sessions together to address the lingering issues from our past. The therapist suggested that Annie's actions might have been influenced by hormonal imbalances, but Annie rejected this outright. No, she said firmly. I destroyed the most important things in my life that day. I had a loving husband and a daughter who adored me. Nothing, no hormonal imbalance, could excuse what I did. I gave up everything good in my life for someone who wasn't worth it. She turned to me, a bittersweet smile on her face. Arthur and Sally deserved better from me, she admitted, tears streaming as she dabbed her eyes with a tissue. It took me 5 years to repair what I ruined. I thank God every day that you've let me back into your life. And Tina, too. She blushed slightly as she acknowledged Tina's grace. She had every reason to hate me, but instead she's treated me with nothing but kindness. I'm lucky, even though I lost everything. I let go of that part of my life, knowing I would carry its weight for years to come. Annie seemed to gain much more from our counseling sessions than I did, though I found comfort in the confirmation that neither Sally nor I had been to blame for her decision to leave us. Annie was right about one thing. Tina had brought us together and created a stronger family unit. They say everyone faces the consequences of their actions, and Paul was no exception. After moving to another state, he tried once again to exploit a married woman for financial gain. This time, however, the woman's husband caught him red-handed and took justice into his own hands, leaving Paul permanently incapacitated. The husband was sentenced to 10 years in prison, though according to Rhonda's gossip, he might be released earlier. Tina and I are still madly in love. I never thought it possible to love someone as much as I had loved Annie, but Tina proved me wrong. She didn't just love me, she gave me all of herself. We continue working side by side at her company, and I remain in the same role. Like any couple, we have our disagreements, but we always focus on communication when it matters most. Her figure is as stunning as ever, and our intimate life remains vibrant. We still make love often, even in adventurous places while traveling. My unfaithful wife left me for a younger man, but my revenge and newfound love made her regret every choice. Arthur, are you listening? Just sign the papers, and we're done, my wife, Annie, said with finality. We'd been married for over 25 years, but her words seemed to fade into the distance as she ranted on. It had all started earlier that day when I returned from work. Annie was seated at the table with a glass of wine and an unwavering expression. Oddly, she hadn't poured a second glass, not even considering whether I might want one, especially given where the discussion was headed. As I sat down, sensing something was wrong, Annie wasted no time. Without even asking about my day, she announced her decision. She was leaving me